Hi everyone, this is Ellen George with Great Lakes Cisco, and we're here at the, and there you are too, and here we are at the Coregonid Symposium in Bayfield, Wisconsin. I'm going to be sharing Willie Fetzer's poster with you guys on 40 years of changes in Wisconsin's bloater chub fishery in Lake Michigan. Willie is with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. If you have any questions during the broadcast, feel free to type them in and I can relay them to Willie. And with that, I'm going to switch it over. And Willie,
great.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Ellen. So the first thing I want to do is acknowledge my co-author, specifically Dylan, who really helped process the data. It's a lot of information going into this, and trying to summarize 40 years across space and time is quite an effort. And also my other co-authors, who really are the ones that were out there. Some of these folks were riding these chub boats back in the early 90s, and in January, in February, and just listening to some of the stories that they tell, it's pretty impressive. So the motivation for us reevaluating the 40 years of chub fishing in Wisconsin is that chub, as you can see from the trends in USGS trawls, have really declined. If you look at our total harvest in the 1997, which is our peak during this time period, it was over 4 million pounds. In 2012 was the lowest we've seen, and it was only 20,000 pounds. So with that, throughout this time period, though, our quota has remained unchanged. And so we've been trying to reevaluate potential mechanisms to set a quota that kind of tracks the abundance over time. And with that, we wanted to look at both evaluating our fishery-dependent and fishery-independent monitoring program to assess within those spatial and temporal dynamics in chub harvest and population demographics, and also start to consider and explore options that we can update our commercial quota. And so folks from USGS and other places have spent a lot of time looking into what's driving these changes, and some of the mechanisms are both ecosystem changes, so introductions of dracaenid mussels and oligotropin through nutrient reductions, decreases in disappearance of diparia, which is a major food source of bloater chubs, harvest by commercial fishers, and then also intrinsic population factors, so things like population sex ratio and age structure. And so we're not going to look into that too much, but hopefully this research that we do can help contribute to future efforts to try to figure out what's driving these trends. So the data that we're using is the commercial harvest monitoring. This gives us information on commercial effort, location, and total harvest data. We only use data going back to 1990 because this is sort of what was most easily available, but we plan to go further back because we've been monitoring harvest since the 1970s. For a subset of these commercial sets, we also have information on the composition of the harvest. So that's things like what's the age and size structure and sex ratios. To complement that, we've also been doing a graded mesh gillnet surveys that have been conducted since 1984. This is a series of gillnets that are about 130 feet with panels of 100-foot panels of 1.5, 1.75, and 2-inch mesh, 200-foot panel of 2.25-inch mesh, 300 feet of 2.5-inch mesh, and 200 feet of 2.75-inch mesh, and 300 feet of 3-inch mesh. And from this, we get a little bit more standardized information on catch per unit effort, but also that information on length, weight, and sex and age structure. And so what we look at when we look at harvest by gear, we see that historically in the early 90s, there was about equal harvest between the gillnet fishery and the trawl fishery. And what's interesting is that if you're a chub fisherman, the gillnet fishery is the only amount of your harvest that counts against your quota. So in some of these years where 50% of the total harvest was from this trawl fishery, which is essentially these chubs were bycatch in a smelt fishery, none of that was counting against their quota. And so this is pretty interesting. One thing to point out is this is called unsorted chubs in the data, and so there's some question about whether or not, what proportion of that might be alewives or other species that they're catching out there. But my suspicion is that a lot of it was likely young, smaller chubs. When we look at changes in space and where this fishery was occurring, we see historically during 1990 to 2005, and this is when the total chub harvest was over 1 million pounds. The fishery was distributed across the Wisconsin coastline, even in the Green Bay, though it was still tended to be focused right in the middle here. Whereas now when we look, a lot of these sort of the places on the extremes have very little harvest, if any. And so even though you see some harvest here, these are still only, maybe some of these may be only 5 pounds per year. So really limited harvest. But it's still focused on the center here, which is interesting because that is also the location that separates the northern and southern basins of Lake Michigan. So there's a little bit of a bridge connecting that could provide good juvenile and adult chub habitat. Similar, this sort of shows you the same thing of being focused right in the middle there, but what's interesting is this trawl fishery that, again, remember I said in some years was over 2 million pounds, was only occurring in one port. So the localized impact of that fishery could have been fairly significant, especially when you consider that these are a relatively small number of year classes and they're really small fish. So 2 million pounds of a 1 to 2 ounce fish could be up to 20,000 or 20 million fish removed there. And then finally, when we look at sort of who's doing this fishery and when, historically the chub fishery was relatively distributed across the year, and now it's really just limited to those winter months, and that's when these fish are aggregating. And it's also really limited to only, from 60 to 70 fishermen in the heyday to now maybe only 8 or 9 in any given year. When we look at trends in population, we see essentially some of the same trends that the USGS folks are seeing in their more extensive trawl survey. So changes in sex ratio over time, a little bit different in the commercial versus the assessment, and that makes sense because the commercial is using only the larger mesh. It's targeting those adult, larger female fish. Catch per unit effort trends showing a decrease, and then also in both length and age structure, we see this decreasing trend over time. And so how this is useful is that in terms of spatial and temporal dynamics, the fishery's really it's focused so much now on just this very limited area during a small portion of the year. And so from our perspective, this is useful because we can then, if we want to better characterize that fishery, focus on the commercial fishery during that time of year, and potentially in a world of limited budgets, consider doing less of our assessment, which is going to take a lot more time and effort when you get 6 or 7 people on the boat maintaining that in the water, and also better characterizing this trawl fishery because we don't have good information on the length or age structure or even the species composition of what that actually is, even though it's coded as unsorted chubs. And then finally, with that information, hopefully come up with a catch at age model that can help us explore different harvest scenarios and how that might affect the productivity of the fishery. So that's kind of it.
Awesome. Questions from anyone?
Yeah, so historically we were using scales. We switched to OLIF in 2002 and realized that the scales are probably only good to about 6 or 7, and then they really start to diverge. And if you look here, the fish aren't even showing up in the fishery. They haven't recruited to that mesh size until that age, and so we really don't trust. And how do you trying to come up with some sort of correction factor is really going to be difficult.
Awesome. I'm going to sign off because we're getting called back to our seats, but thank you so much, Willie.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And if you have any questions in the future, go ahead and just comment on this video, and I can relay them to Willie later. Thanks. Bye.